the most disturbing deathbed confession you've ever heard? Story 1. My mother started confessing to killing her friend when she was a teenager. She had been senile for about a year and usually didn't talk much, but she was speaking directly and clearly. Her story was very detailed, and we were just sitting there horrified. A few hours later, she was back in a more sedated state, and someone figured out it was the plot of a book by an author she loved. I don't know how much she was aware of anything at that point. She died early the next morning, but she would have absolutely laughed her off if she knew what she did to us. Story 2. A nurse once shared that an old man confessed to sabotaging his brother's parachute during WW2 because they were in love with the same woman. His brother died, and the woman married someone else anyway. He said he lived with the guilt every single day. Story 3. Not really anything compared to murders and not really a confession. But the day my great-grandfather died, he asked me to retrieve a suitcase from under his bed and throw it away. It was full of toys. He was 98. So good for him. But also I wish I had just thrown it away. Story 4. I watched a video, and this super old granny in Alaska talked about how she killed her abusive husband in Tennessee or wherever. So she thought about it for months. Was abused during and before that. Then she asked him to fix something up high in the barn, hid some rakes under hay, and straight up pushed the ladder and made him fall on the rakes, killing him. So she calls the police, I think it was like 1940, 1950s times, and they investigate it and find he fell on accident. She moves to Alaska and lives a lone and fulfilling and happy life. Story 5. Wasn't deathbed, but my grandma told us that her dad and uncles murdered the man who raped her and disposed of the body. She waited until after they all passed away to tell people. Story 6. Not quite a confession, but near the end of my mom's life, she asked, "Where are my boys?" My twin, and I thought she meant girls. So we told her we were there. After she died, the day before the funeral, we got a call from a PI asking if they could speak to my mom. I told them she had just passed away, and the PI shared that they represented a client looking for their biological mother. I was seriously thinking it was someone that somehow heard my mom had passed and was trying to get money. At the time, I was grieving, so it seemed that plausible. I decided to hear her out, and she was absolutely describing my mother and parts of her life that no scammer would have known. Come to find out, our mother had 2 boys from 2 different men prior to marrying our father. One of the men was from her hometown, the other was from Japan. So much of her life before our dad was an enigma suddenly. Both her sisters had Alzheimer's, so no information was ever shared with us. Story 7. I don't think I'd call this a confession, but it was just before he died. I volunteered at a hospice, and there was a guy who had pretty severe dementia. Before he passed, he started reliving a moment from when he was drafted for Vietnam. He mistook me and another volunteer for his war buddies, and apparently they had murdered a man and his family when they got back. From what he was saying, it wasn't supposed to be the whole family, but things spiraled and they wound up killing the man, his wife, and her parents. He was unnervingly calm, not panicked, just calculated. He didn't acknowledge anything we were telling him either. He was stuck in that memory. He was in the middle of going over how to hide the bodies when he slipped back into his normal self and then refused to talk anymore about anything to anyone. He passed away shortly before dinner time the same day. Story 8. My great-grandpa came home from WW1, and his family had a great big party. He noticed his 13-year-old sister was missing, so he went and looked for her. He found their neighbor raping her. He yanked the man off of her and told her to go to their mom. We don't know if he beat him or killed him immediately, but on her deathbed, my grandma said she hid his clothing buried in the front yard from that night, and the body is long gone. Where the clothing is supposedly buried, there is a beautiful patch of iris that grows. Story 9. I heard about this guy. Late 80s, sweet on the outside. Grandpa vibes and always baking cookies for the neighbors. Active in the church, everyone loved him. But on his deathbed, he apparently looked his daughter dead in the eyes and said that he's not who people think he is. Turns out he had another entire family 2 towns over. Not just an affair, but a full-blown second wife, kids, birthdays, holidays, the whole thing. He kept both lives going for like 40 years, and the families didn't know about each other until that very moment. Story 10. Not a confession, but a pretty funny story of my grandfather. So I was the closest person to him in the family. I was flying home to try and see him and missed him passing by an hour. When I arrived, everyone started asking me questions. Seems he sat up in bed, turns to others and said, "Let me tell you a story. I'm not his name. I am an assassin, and my name is Jonas McGilfrey. I've hidden $2 million in gold bullets." He then laid down and passed away. The entire family figured I had to know about it because of how close we were. I used to skip school and go to his house all the time when he got a new silent film in on VHS. I had no idea what he was talking about. Family spent a lot of time trying to figure it out. I stumbled across the answer a few years later. He was a big Louis L'Amour fan. I wasn't, but on a whim, I picked up a book and started reading. Right there, the book started out. "I'm not XXXX. My name is Jonas McGilfrey SP, and I've hidden $2 million in gold bullets." I know it's not exactly how worded in the book, but Close enough. It's been almost 30 years now. I gave the book to my mom and she's shared it with the family. It's so like my grandfather to pull something like this, honestly. He was an absolute character in life. Miss him greatly, and man, I still laugh at this. Story 11. My grandfather looked at me when I was 16 and apologized for the assault he committed against my mother when she was a child. Still with me to this day that he did that and thought I'd be the person to forgive him. Story 12. Not really a deathbed confession, but I was working in a hospital geriatric ward and I walked into the room of an older ill woman who immediately confided in me that she didn't have a vagina but was married for 35 years and kept her husband very happy. That always stuck with me. I really didn't know how to respond. Maybe her intent was to get me to remember her. Story 13. Not really a confession, but supposedly, my great-grandmother's second husband was a piece of, like, kid-diddling, money-grubbing type POS. And my dad and my aunt always told me when that man passed, he didn't go peacefully. He kept seeing things on the ceiling, crawling on his legs, and was screaming, "Get him off me! Get him off me! Don't let them take me." That story always creeped me out as a kid. Story 14. Context. My mom was the last person I really had in my close family. Sort of a deathbed confession. My mom, after she died, left me her will and a letter. In that letter, she told me I was adopted, after it asked repeatedly over the years if I were adopted. Functionally, everybody that knew my parents knew. That me up pretty good, not gonna lie. So if you, my dear Redditors, have adopted a child, please tell them before you die, and don't lie to them, because that was an immensely shitty way to find out. Story 15. It's nowhere near the level of what some of these are, but growing up, my mother and grandmother had always been very estranged. They had an arm's-length relationship, and the only times we visited were generally a disaster. But to her credit, my mom tried and wanted me to have a grandmother, and the memories that came with it. She tried her best, but something was very off. Small details trickled out over the years, but they were vague. When it was time for my grandmother to die, I remember on her deathbed, I visited, my mother did not, and my grandmother told me right before she passed, "Tell your mother I always really loved her, despite everything." That was a strange thing for her to say, because why would that have been something she needed to say? I didn't tell my mom right away because after my grandmother died, she was oddly emotionless, and I felt like it was not something my mom needed to hear just then. A few years later, the truth came out when we were talking over the phone. My mom told me that when she was 5, my grandmother tried to run her over with a car because she found out her affair partner was molesting my mother. She wanted to get rid of her. It didn't work because a neighbor saw and intervened, so my mom ended up getting sent overseas to her father's mother's home to be safe, while that got dealt with and my grandparents got divorced. Times being what they were, however, when my mom returned, her mother got custody of her. It ended up with my mother running away, being homeless, getting pregnant very young by a much older man, a secret sister I never knew about, and I was pretty floored. When she told me, I figured that it made a little more sense why my grandmother had said that, so I shared that with my mother finally. She just said, well, she had a strange way of showing it, and that was that. Story 16. Not exactly a deathbed, but near it. When I first started dating my wife, her grandmother made a speech about making sure I would treat her granddaughter right and not abuse her. She said she slipped extra Tylenol into her abusive husband's coffee, and he died of a massive heart attack. I thought she was just making up something to make me scared. At her funeral, I brought that joke up, and my wife said her grandpa died of a massive heart attack. I think she actually did it. Story 17. Had a 80-year-old something patient tell me when his wife was dying, she admitted to having multiple affairs throughout their long 60-year marriage. She went as far to say she never loved him, and his only son wasn't his. I was transporting him to ED. He likely only had months left to live, wanted to share with me. Still think about this often. Story 18. My grandma is almost 90. She had several brothers and sisters. All of them have blonde hair and blue eyes. She has brown hair and brown eyes and a slightly darker skin tone. On my great-grandma's deathbed, she said, "I need to tell you something. When I was younger, I had an affair with a Cherokee man. My grandma had already pieced this together long ago. She always told me that she was half Cherokee. Anyways, a couple years ago, my dad did this genealogy kit from ancestors, Native American. I was told not to tell grandma." Story 19. When I was 10 or 11, my grandfather passed away from cirrhosis of the liver. He was a happy, functioning alcoholic. I was in his hospital room alone with him the day he passed, scared because of how different he looked from the man I'd always known. He'd lost like half his body weight and looked skeletal. He held my hand and told me that his father, my great-grandfather, killed 4 men in their beds with him because they'd raped a colored girl and the law wouldn't do anything about it. He went into gory detail that bordered on torture. I still have mental scars 35 years later. I didn't understand all of that at the time, and it wasn't until years later telling my mom about it that she confirmed and explained it in a more gentle detail. Apparently, my great-grandfather and his brother may have also been professional or maybe serial killers, and supposedly killed upwards of 25 KKK members across Alabama, Georgia, and northern Florida. Story 20. Oh man, I finally have a story. I worked as an MRI tech aide in college, and my job was simply to bring people to and from their hospital room for an MRI. One day, I was asked to get this nice, elderly, big Italian man. He was a big human, think 64 260. I would have placed him in his early 70s. And he sadly had early onset dementia. We had short but nice chats on the way to and from the MRI. On the way back to his room, he told me how he was the guy called when his buddies needed to take care of business. I believe my naive response was something along the lines of, "Oh, what kind of business were your buddies in?" "All kinds. But they would call him when they needed to take of a guy." So that's when it hit me what he was saying. I chuckled to myself, attributed it to the dementia as we got back to his room. When we got back to his room, his 3 kids and spouses ranging 40 to 50-ish were all there waiting on him. You could tell they were saddened by the condition of their father, but nevertheless were kind, and smiled at me as I began getting him hooked back up to his O2 and heart monitors. One of his daughters asked how he's been. The gentleman said he was feeling okay and he had just gotten back from getting an MRI with me. It was that moment that he said to his family very nonchalantly, "Yeah, I was just telling this young man how I used to take care of business back in the day." It was at that moment all 6 faces turned somber in unison and turned and looked at me in unison. "Ah, well, yes, what a great story. Well, have a nice day, everyone," in the most cheerful voice I could muster. Never mentioned a word. Don't even remember the gentleman's name. Probably for the best. Story 21. My gran was on her deathbed and was convinced she was going to because she stole money from the church rectory 50 years earlier to help feed her 10 young children. I think gran saying that was more upsetting to my aunts than her actual death. Not because of the stealing, because we all agree that a decent God wouldn't care when someone stole to feed children, but just how adamant gran was that she was going to because of it. Made for some drama before she passed, for sure. R.I.P. Grandma. Story 22. My grandma told my sister and I that our uncle, her oldest, was not actually our grandpa's son. She was raped by her brother-in-law's brother and met my grandfather soon after. He didn't care that my uncle wasn't his. He raised him just like he was his own. She asked us to never tell anyone. We never have. Story 23. My great-grandmother told me that our family had built the aqueducts in Spain, but many years ago cousins of ours stole our fortune, and anyone from our family that went to claim it has disappeared. Story 24. Not a deathbed confession, but when my aunt was a college student in the late 1960s, she applied for a grant to study ecology in Borneo. She delayed accepting her fiance's proposal while she waited for an answer. She waited and waited and waited. My grandmother, who was a huge fan of my aunt's fiance, worried that the relationship wouldn't survive if she took off to Borneo for a year. She was incredibly relieved when my aunt took the radio silence as a rejection and accepted his proposal. Decades later, living a happy life with a successful husband and 3 high-achieving daughters, my aunt mentioned something about the time she wanted to study in Borneo. That was when my grandmother told her the day before the wedding, an envelope came to my grandparents' house telling my aunt her grant application had been approved. Concerned she would spoil her future, my grandmother threw the envelope in the trash. Story 25. My maternal grandfather apparently confessed that he saw the ghost of his daughter who had died a few years prior, the day before he had a major heart attack that took his life. It came to light that he had abused her as a child, and my grandmother basically knew and did nothing to protect her kids. The revelation imploded my family, but not until nearly 20 years after he died. Crazy. Story 26. I'm a nurse. A co-worker of mine got a true deathbed confession. She was actively dying, saying they'll never find him. He deserves it. Went to sleep and passed an hour later. Story 27. We thought MG Granny was dying. The hospital has asked us all, my mum and my brother and sister, to come and say goodbye. We are going in one by one with my mum, and one of the things that my granny keeps bringing up is that she's sad for me as I'm single and won't be having any. Good to know where her priorities were when she was about to die. Story 28. My grandmother confessed to me that her oldest brother was the product of. My great-grandmother had him when she was 14. To be clear, her dad, my great-great-grandfather, raped her. I was 17 when she told me this, and I said I wouldn't have been able to raise that baby. She said she had no choice, and if that didn't scare the ever-living out of me in 1997. Story 29. Not quite deathbed, recovering from hospice, but then back to hospice? My grandfather was in the hospital and was talking to my grandma, and he was pretty out of it and had this conversation with my grandma. When I get out of here, we're getting a hotel. Why, honey? So we can have hot wild man was 86, and I was like, "Kay, I'm gonna go get a soda." Story 30. Not a confession, but as my grandmother was about to die, she rattled off a list of names of people who she owed a debt of favor or gratitude, and a list of people who've wronged her. She made sure my father knew and remembered. My grandmother was tough as a nail and survived enough horrors for multiple lifetimes: Japanese occupation during WD Chinese Civil War, Cultural Revolution, etc. I like to think it was her way of making sure that even death cannot save people who've wronged her from her wrath. And if you're a Trekkie, yes, this is very Cardassian. Story 31. One weekend, A demented patient kept repeatedly telling me about someone he and his friends beat up and assaulted after the war. I assumed it would have been around early 1950s. Apparently, they took his wallet, but what struck my attention was the undertone to it and the lack of panic in his voice. Usually, dementia patients that think something is lost or stolen are very anxious. He wasn't. He just kept saying he and his buddies beat him up bad and took his wallet. And I am 99. Sure, he was talking about a racial hate crime. The timing adds up and his details of the event were too clean. He was a respectful guy with a good family and wife and kids. A good Midwestern family man. Something happened with him and his friends one night, and it wasn't good. There was a regret to the story, but it really just seemed like he wanted to tell someone finally. I've been a nurse 15 years. I worked a locked dementia unit at the start of my career. I did the week-long dementia state certifications to become a trainer. I sadly know dementia well and I interact well with them. You just go to their world and live there with them. This was different though. He kept repeating the same story all weekend and details didn't change. That's unusual for a dementia patient. It wasn't a story or behavior he was known for telling over and over again either. I'm convinced that guy was reliving that night from 60 years ago and telling me something happened. It wasn't a dementia false reality. I'll never forget him. I still know what room he was in and everything about it. Only time I've been spooked and I've literally had 2,000 patients and called 100 deaths. This was different. Story 32. When my country was suffering a civil war, one little girl around 6 years old who lived near my grandmother got bit by a dog with rabies. They could not vaccinate her, and the girl started to show symptoms. As the disease is deadly in this stage, the doctor and the family decided that the most humane solution was to mercy kill her. My grandmother, who was a teenager then, still remembered that the whole family was crying while walking down the street to the doctor's office. The father was holding the little and she was trying to eat bread but could not swallow it and had a little bit of foam in the corners of her mouth. She was haunted by the little girl's story for her whole life. Story 33. Not necessarily a deathbed confession. Sorry, I don't have anything else. 3 years ago, I reconnected with a friend from high school. I remember texting with her briefly, catching up, working through the issues we had when we were younger. I was in college and working 2 jobs, so I didn't have time to chat much. But one of our conversations somehow came to her sobriety and avoiding certain kinds of drugs. She was so proud that she was sober. She told me don't touch anything but weed, Molly, or nicotine. I didn't think much of it at the time and went about my day. She was an addict. She died from an overdose 2 weeks later. I miss her. Story 34. Last thing my grandpa said to me before he died was, "Women are stupid." Made my grandma burst out a nervous laugh like, oh, he's just being cheeky. But the look he gave me, and then her, it was definitive. Then I left and he died a couple days later. Story 35. Rumor is a priest at our local hospital confesses his sins to the dying, whispering in their ears before they pass away horrible things he did to little indigenous children in the 60s, 70s. Story 36. I used to care for people who were disabled in some way in their homes. One man I cared for was elderly, over 80 years old and just needed help with the day-to-day things like cooking and cleaning, driving places, etc. He was a perverted guy and always had something to say to the ladies. Some cognitive issues, with impulse control being the main thing he lacked, which led to lots of inappropriate comments to women, theft from stores, and random fast walks that he needed to be redirected go back to the house. One evening, we were sitting on his porch and he asked me what the date was. After I told him, he was very emotional and sad, and shared it was the day he lost his family. I knew he had no family who visited or cared for him, and that he had been being cared for by agencies for decades. I saw the obituaries he had hanging in the house, and only one mentioned him as a survivor. It was clear the family stopped including him when he was young. He confessed that when he was a teenager, he touched his little sister. When she told, he strangled her to death. He shared details of how he buried her under a sign next to the road. He described the dress she was wearing and how mommy was never the same and daddy tried to kill me when they found her. I'll never know for certain if it was a false memory from his cognitive decline or if he confessed the reason he had no family in his life and was not mentioned in any of the obituaries of his parents and siblings, and only in the one of his grandmother. But I will say I believed him as he was telling me. It felt different than any other of his stories that you knew were probably not true or exaggerated. He passed away a couple weeks later. Story 37. I asked my dad, before he got out of it when he was dying, if there were any family secrets. Nope. But I did find out at his funeral that my mother's grandmother shot a woman in church, look at my post history, and a week later at lunch with his racist cousin, I realized the family feud on his side was not over 600 but racism. I wish I got to ask my dad if he married a black woman out of spite. Either way, I'm glad he did. Story 38. Before my grandma passed, she acknowledged that in 1949 at the age of 17 and a senior in high school, she became pregnant with my mom, obviously not married to my grandpa until 4 months later. I told her that we all could do the math, already knew her secret, and loved her anyway. Story 39. My patient told me to tell her daughter she was right the whole time, so when she came in, I did. The patient had just passed. The daughter stared at me and became upset and yelled that I was lying, so I just stood quiet and left the room. Apparently, the lady wasn't her biological mom, and she had kidnapped her. The daughter did a 23andMe and found out about some relatives, and the mom never admitted it. I wish I could have found out more. Story 40. Found out that on my grandmother's deathbed, she told a couple of my aunts that she cheated on my grandfather for years, and the 3 youngest out of 14 children were not my grandfather's kids. I'm 35, and just discovered this information 2 years ago, and it messed with me for weeks. Story 41. I worked with a patient with dementia for a few days in a hospital setting who was constantly rambling nonsense but would occasionally say things like, "I love your breasts." I'm male, so assumed he was either hallucinating or reliving something from his past, or maybe I just do have exquisite breasts. One day after we were able to get him to eat something, he went to sleep for a while, and when he woke up a few hours later, he looked me straight in the eyes and clear as day said, "I used to make love to my mother, and I can't wait to see her again." He then went back to rambling before falling back to sleep, quickly deteriorating, and he passed before the end of my shift. I always wonder if it was a truth or nonsense, but it has always stuck with me. Story 42. My grandfather apparently told my mom that he thought he killed his last wife. Not my grandmother, but his wife after her. He had dementia at the time of confession. She died suddenly, but I didn't know there was anything to it. But I then was told by my mom that he had held a knife to my grandmother more than once while they were together. He was a shitty person, but I didn't know he was that shitty until he was gone. Story 43. Sort of a deathbed confession? It took place over a period of about a year before he died. My very smart, very secretive neighbor had a stroke and got a thing called atypical aphasia. In normal aphasia, the victim can't talk. This man couldn't stop talking, and he couldn't just babble. He had to communicate with someone about something. And it turned out that he used to work on the US military's secret germ warfare program. He had near-perfect memory. He remembered names, dates, dosages, protocols, everything, and he was compelled to talk about it to anyone near him, all day, every day. The local TV station sent a camera crew over to record him. I listened to him for a while, but it was brutal. I just couldn't listen to the desperate, non-stop stream of information for more than a few hours. I probably should have taken notes. I do miss him. Story 44. My ex's grandmother told me that she hit someone with her car and kept driving thinking they were an animal. Later finding out that one of her friend's husbands was walking home drunk after spending time with a buddy was hit by a car, and it was most likely him. He recovered but was permanently messed up and had issues walking pain for the rest of his life. No one believed me when I told them she said that. Story 45. A few years ago, my mom knew a woman who was diagnosed with late-stage cancer. Before she passed away, she made a shocking confession to her husband. She told him that all 3 of their sons were not his biological children. Their real father was actually her own father. The boys were around 10, 8, and 7 years old at the time. After she died, the husband had DNA tests done, which confirmed that he was not the biological father. The tests also showed that the boys' biological father was indeed their maternal grandfather. The woman's father, who was in his 70s, was arrested and later sent to prison, where he eventually died. Despite learning the truth, the husband decided to raise the boys as his own. He said he had noticed early on that there was something different about them. For example, they didn't seem to feel pain the way other children did. At the time, he didn't think much of it, but looking back, it stood out more clearly. Story 46. My great-grandmother fostered 9 children and adopted 2. She tried for 7 years to conceive. My grandmother was her only biological child. This was in the 40s and 50s. She got fed up of trying with her husband and got pregnant with the neighbor who had 3 daughters. The families were very close and spent holidays together. I guess the neighbor looked an awful lot like great-grandfather. Nobody ever questioned it. Her husband died years before, and she had Alzheimer's, so we didn't get much of an explanation. We like to think it was agreed upon, and my great-grandfather was aware, since it was before surrogacy and IVF, but we truly have no clue. Story 47. I used to work as a hospice nurse, and there was one family I was working with where dad was sick with liver cancer, lifelong alcoholic, sadly typical outcome with mets to the stomach and bone and a lot of other stuff. But those were the source of most of the pain we were struggling to control. We had finally graduated him up to fentanyl patches, and he was kind of tightrope walking between the bliss of opioids with brief interruptions of the "that is cancer" completely up your body. Still, even in these up scenarios, you get these strange moments of lucidity that break through. One nurse told us about a lady who had gone to bed about a month prior. Generally with cancer, once they go to bed, they don't come back from it. Or if they do, they really don't come back that far. They were having a family meeting with the nurse and other members of the treatment team when she sat up suddenly and told everyone, "I've been talking with the administrator and he told me that everything is going to be fine." Then she lay back down and died. So while it was surprising, it wasn't out of place when this guy, who was in his 80s, sat up suddenly and had one of these moments. It's still surprising no matter how many times it happens though, you're never prepared for it. Well, He sat right up and looked around the room. Then I could swear to God I heard a little drum beating somewhere, and he began to shout, "I like to move it," and proceeded to sing the entire song as though from memory, with the family backing his vocals like one collective hype man. It was truly magical and the kind of story that people will never believe unless they're there to see it. Story 48. My grandma asked for a Coke the day before she died. She never drank Coke and always disliked it. A couple days ago, it was 6 years. I miss you, Maggie. Story 49. Not disturbing or a deathbed confession, but my grandma was in poor health when she told me. But she did tell me that she had with Frank Sinatra. So that's cool, I guess. I believe her too, as she was a somewhat famous burlesque dancer. Story 50. When my grandpa was close to passing away, he told me how my grandma was mad at him for many years, because soon after they married, he made a pass at a battered woman from work that she let stay with them for some time to get on her feet. I was appalled and never knew anything about it. I mean, I get he was dying, but he said it so nonchalantly and just said I was thinking with my other head. Like, clearly. Totally understand why she resented him for that. That's wrong on so many levels. Story 51. Nothing. Silence. I'd like to know what he was thinking or feeling. Said see you later, and that was it. He died soon after. He loved Jesus, so I'd like to think he's in heaven, but I know I can't be sure. Story 52. My only kind of thing was, just after we had called an old man that had died in his living room. He was on his back and his wife asked if she could say goodbye. This old lady then got down on the floor next to him, kissed his head, gave him one last kiss, and said, "You did good," and thanked him for everything for all the years and thanked him for his love, kissed him one last time, repeated "you did good," then I helped her up. Her and the neighbor then went and sat in the other room and started speaking about how great he was. Story 53. My mom was dying, and we asked her if she had anything important to tell us. She thought really hard, then lost focus. We could see it. My sister asked her again just anything that was important. My mom looked at her and said, "Columbus?" It was the last thing she said. Sometimes, last words don't mean. Story 54. I didn't hear it directly per se, but my great-grandfather told my grandparents on his deathbed that he had another family before even meeting my great-grandmother post-WW2, but his wife and children died in a Nazi concentration camp, and he was the only one to make it out of there alive. We don't know about any other details than that. I didn't get to know my great-grandpa sadly, but I still think about him and what he lived through sometimes. Story 55. Now, I'm not sure if I've got this 100 right, cuz it's third hand, and sorry if it's not exactly disturbing, but one of my aunt's friends suddenly got told she had 3 months to live. Loads of people were visiting her in hospital, and of course, so did her best friend. Once they were alone, as she lay in her hospital bed, she asked her best friend to close the curtains. She asked her friend to sit down and said she had something to tell her. The friend was confused but listened closely. The lady in her bed proceeded to tell her best friend that she had an affair with her husband for over 30 years and that they were still seeing each other now. She begged for forgiveness and said she had to get that off her chest before she dies. The friend apparently didn't say a word and left the room. Moments later, a doctor came in and told the lady in the bed that they'd mixed her papers up with another patient and that she's got the all clear and free to go home. Story 56. One of those, not a confession either, but I was told by my mother that my grandfather on my father's side killed a man in his youth cause that man had owed my grandfather a lot of money. Said that my grandfather buried the gun and never spoke about again. This all happened in a very rural part of their home country, so it was all barren and were mostly farms. Story 57. Man on hospice for cancer summoned his kids a day or so before he died to confess that he killed his wife, the mother of the children, who he reported missing 30-some years prior. The dude planned it all out perfectly. Wife had some kind of trip plan. Man kills wife, rents chipper, dismembers wife, puts her through the chipper into a decent-sized stream on their property. After he's done, lights chipper on fire, lets it burn, then turns it into insurance a few days later. When wife fails to return home from trip, he reports her missing. Kids had absolutely no clue. Crime would have gone completely unsolved if he didn't confess. I didn't hear the confession, but was involved with some search warrants on the property after the kids reported it to state police.